Hello, and it's my pleasant duty to welcome Neil Spiller, the editor of Architectural Design, to talk to us about what he's called the 7 continua of post-digital architecture. Neil has had a long and distinguished career in the world of the academy, both at University College London, the University of Greenwich, and now in Ottawa. Neil, over to you.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for inviting me. I don't know whether it's distinguished, but it's certainly been a long career. I'm just trying to get my auto cue up. Oh, here we are. Right. So I'm going to talk to you, as Paul said, about the 7 continua of post-digital architecture, and I'm going to show you some of the more speculative projects on those series of spectra. But first, I'm going to, and I apologise for this, I'm going to read something I wrote earlier, and it won't take long, so trust me. Every architectural designer is different and feels that they have something original to bring to the world, solving a problem in an original or idiosyncratic way. No 2 designers are the same, no 2 designs the same, no 2 sites are the same, and no 2 observers or users are the same. And all change over time and have varying durations. These facts should lead you to a view that the world is exceptional as a series of personal and conversational mnemonic events. Your design work within this blooming tapestry, should do nothing more than exploit this paradigm. So I want you to think of the world as a mixing desk, a music mixing desk with a series of 7 sliders on it. And the first one is space. The second one is technology. The third one is narrative, semiotics, and performance. The fourth one is cyborgian geography. The fifth one, nicked from Martin Jay, the visual philosopher, scopic regimes. 6, sensitivity. And 7, the most important one from our old friend Cedric, time. So I'm just going to say a couple of sentences about each one and start showing you the work. There is a continuum of space. So there is a continuum of architectural space that stretches from having no computer, mobile phone, connectivity, or digital presence whatsoever to full bodily immersion in virtual reality. So that's space. Technology, ranging from simple prosthetics, the stone axe, for example, via the Victorian cog and cam, to the valve, capacitor, logic gate, integrated circuit, central processing unit, quantum computer, stem cell, nanobot, and a million states between, is the continuum of technology. So narrative, semiotics, and performance. An architect or designer can choose whether their work operates along a continuum that ranges from minimal engagement in quotation or mnemonic nuance in relation to the history of culture to full-blown historical quotation. A design might conjure new conjunctions of semiotics as a way of rereading them. It can also integrate itself with human and cultural memory, reflexively or performatively, in real time or retrospectively. So 4, cyborgian geography. An architect can posit work, not just an architect can posit work that operates in all manner of mixed and augmented terrains that are subject to all manner of geolocative, geomorphic, and cybermorphic factors and drivers. Scopic regimes. Architecture can exist at all scales. It all depends on the resolution of the scope that one chooses to use. Continents, oceans, cities, streets, rooms, carpets, micro landscapes, and medico landscapes are all in this continuum. 6, sensitivity. A designer might decide to make objects, spaces, or buildings whose parts are sensitive and pick up environmental variations or receive information. Sensors can make objects and buildings that are influenced by events elsewhere, or indeed are influential elsewhere. Sometimes, though, it might be preferable to make dumb objects instead of smart objects and architectures. So the final one, the most important one, time, the most important of these continua. All the above 6 continua can be time dependent. Therefore, designers can mix. That's why there's the picture of the mixing desk in their presentation. So they can mix the movement of their spaces, buildings, and objects up and down the other 6 continua. A design can oscillate the spaces within itself with varying elements of virtuality, sensitivity over time using different technologies. So that's me finished with my eulogy to the 7 continua. So I'm going to start showing you some work. And it's work that's been developed over the last decade or so from my students, really. And whilst it doesn't sort of explicitly relate to the continua, you will get the idea that there's a variety of different ways that architecture can be perceived and designed 20 years into the 21st century. So the first project, a lot of these projects come from my avatar group, the Advanced Virtual and Technological Architecture Research Group, which was formed at 2004 in the Bartlett at University College London. And when I left there in 2010, I took it to Greenwich. So the first thing is, can you herd fish in the salt pan basins of the Camargue? I think it's the black trout, but don't quote me on that. To optimize their kind of breeding, mating, and eating with microsound plates inserted into the salt bodies, salt pans. And so this drawing particularly is you're on your back, looking up through the water, through the micro sound plates towards the sun and the surface of the water. I'm just having a little. There we are. So there's a series of drawings. There's a time-based kind of legibility to them. There's different scales of sound plates according to where the fish need to be at certain times and their size relative to their breeding and reproduction system, and etc. And of course, over time, they silt up. And so that becomes part of the view. Again, you're looking with your back on the bottom of the salt pan, looking up through the sound plates as they salt up towards the sun. Nanotechnology, also very important. Scientists often talk about the singularity, the convergence between biotech, infotech, cognotech, and I've forgotten the other one. But anyway, so nanotechnology, NIBC technologies, nano, info, bio, cogno. So nanotech, the idea that we might use performative machines at a molecular scale that are self-replicating, that become not just architectures within the body or outside the body, but also kind of performative and diagnostic. So these are 2 images from one student. Or the performative, the idea that if you take a proscenium arch in a butcher's shop in Islington when the meat's been packed away, and you start to introduce robotics to some of the meat, you could get nighttime performances of the Greek myths. And this is a harpy. So I'm taking you right out there. I'm interested, and I've written quite a lot of books on the idea of surrealism, but particularly surrealism with the impact of 21st century technology, and using the protocols and tactics of space making of surrealism for architectures of the 21st century. And of course, that line through the butcher's shop goes back to the slaughterhouse as well, and becomes a kind of performative robotic thing. Or husbanding growing natural objects. So this is with the use of some theoretical nanotechnology, the idea of growing over 100 years an old-fashioned ship in a copse in Epping Forest, but also using the judicious use of metal corsets around certain bits of the wood to give you very compact, structurally strong timber. And this was a project that was choreographed in about 50 beautiful drawings that talk about how you make. So the elements you can see in the bottom left-hand side of the ship. You can see the elements and how they're formed over time. These are all masters projects, by the way. And so each of the elements of the ship have this kind of corset nanotechnology moving over time, over 100 years cycle. It is moving slightly out into Epping Forest. Well, how do you make a rudder? So these are a series of the same rudder being formed over time with different nanotech, but also different corset placements. So my contention really, generally, in showing you all this stuff is that we don't use the spectrums enough of architectural intervention as much as we should, particularly involving nanotech, biotech, and other technologies. So we move back out of Epping Forest and we start to see the beginning of the boat on the horizon, the silhouette. And then the student, we used to have what was called a bolt-on masters at the Bartlett. So the student would do their diploma, which is now called the masters, and then they would do a bolt-on masters to give them a masters, and that would take an extra 9 months for much reduced fees. So this student did that, topped out on his diploma in part 2, and then topped out on his master's bolt-on. So what we did was we took his tree project, growing the boat out of a tree, and we said, okay, 50 years in, the client dies, and the new client, who's inherited all this stuff, wants a machine that will excavate an obelisk. And so all the machinery has to change to do that. And here are some of the pictures of that change and metamorphosis. I think metamorphosis is very, very important to 21st century architectural discourse. And there's a view slightly out of the kind of complex, as it were. And this is my favorite drawing of that set, which is the obelisk sliding out of the bottom of the drawing, leaving all the debris of 100 years of partial shipbuilding and completed obelisk making. Very cinematic images as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about proto-cells. The Avatar Group, in conjunction with Dr. Rachel Armstrong, is now Professor of Experimental Architecture at Newcastle and was a PhD student of mine. We latched onto a group of scientists at the Southern University of Denmark who were dealing with proto-cells. Now, the idea of proto-cell is a complex one. Some people use it to describe kind of Frankenstein cells that are made up of mitochondria, DNA, nuclei, RNA. But the Southern University of Denmark were very interested in creating protocells that had no genetics about them at all. And we started calling them smart salad dressing. And this is a picture of a protocell. The maximum size of a protocell is basically a soap bubble, about the size of your thumbnail. That's how big they get. And here you can see it depositing a kind of limestone shell. The thing about protocells is you can make them chemotaxic, so you can drive them across chemical gradients and inject the bubble in a way. They operate in aqueous fluid, so it's ecological. You can make them susceptible to light or dark, phototaxic. So you can make them attracted to the dark, or you can make them attracted to the light. There's nothing in them, there's nothing genetic, they're not weird. And And there's a flask of protocells. This flask actually used as a driver for Phil Beasley's Venice Biennale Organon Reef, I think it was called, which kind of flickered, driven by protocells and other mechanisms, in the Venice Biennale in 2010. One of our, working with Rachel and Christian Kerrigan, who did the boat and the obelisk, he did the visualizations, was to speculate about how protocells might save Venice from sinking. And so the idea was introduce protocells into the lagoon and the canal, and they would be attracted to the dark, and they would get into the foundations, which are currently piles, obviously, and so therefore have a kind of stiletto point load, and start to give platform souls to Venice as a way to help Venice stop sinking. And I know that Venice is not sinking just because of that, but and the protocells would deposit limestone reefs and help support Venice. And that took off quite well. So there's a series of, again, of this kind of time-based series of drawings about the protocells and getting into the foundations in the canal, starting to deposit their limestone reefs. The limestone reefs starting to appear in the canal. Or in the lagoon. In a later version of this picture, we did sort out St. Mark's spire. And around about this time, 2012, 2013, 2012, 2010, 2011, we produced an AD protocell architecture as a way of drawing our kind of line in the sand about those technologies and how interesting they might or might not be. And of course, once you've got protocell architecture, you've got soft ornament. So this is the work of a student from the Bartlett who started to get interested in Art Nouveau, René Lalique, and this idea of a movable protocell architecture. And it's for a park in Strasbourg, and these are the various sort of pieces that occupy the park. In a way, a very, very contemporary protocell, Bernard Shaw, Milan Valette, in a way, but very different. And again, beautiful work. And a lot of notation, a lot of ideas about time and movement and metamorphosis. And that's the overall plan of the park. And again, with one of the things that interests me about these technologies is the way that architects need to reevaluate the protocols of architectural representation to cope with those the changing ontologies of the technology. Well, what happens biotech when your kitchen, you know, you're frying an egg and answering emails at the same time? What happens when biotech's introduced into that and the breakfast? Now there's a question. And the kitchen becomes a little biotech lab, as well as somewhere to fry your egg, because that is biotech too. Or soft robotics. This is another PhD student of mine who made very, very, very slow, drippy asphalt and hair robots that were sensitive to human presences in spaces. This is some of his work. And these clusters as very, very small, robotic, beautifully crafted things. Robotics doesn't have to be fast, and it doesn't have to be necessarily that accurate either, but just be alive to its circumstance and context. I think he's now an associate professor at Innsbruck. So this is all the same guy and his a mixture of his masters that he did with me at the Bartlett, but also his PhD, which he also did with me at the Bartlett. Augmented reality. I don't think we think enough about augmented reality. This is obviously what I call a desk bogey, but people are getting into augmented reality. We're used to this sort of thing, maybe not this explicit, but with our phones. But what happens when augmented reality starts to look at the city in other terms? I once did a lecture at Glasgow, and I showed this slide talking about, and I think the ex-head of school said, "What's that, Neil? Is that how many dickheads are in London?" Or the future of the screen. What's that mean architecturally? People are already selling cars off augmented reality. Or the wonderful chest buster from Alien that suddenly bursts out of someone's t-shirted chest when you look at it through an iPhone. So there's lots of fun opportunities. And I don't think us architects think about enough of these potentials. Or what happens when half a room is real and half a room is augmented, or that an architecture posits augmented pieces that can be seen through certain lenses. A student of mine recently started to talk about he'd been to one of Gaudi's villas in Barcelona, and you download an app, you go in with 25 people, and you look through your phone at the architectural detail, which exits out the people. So it seems like as long as you look through your phone, that you're in there on your own. So erasure, like in previous art movements, becomes an architectural tactic. Sorry, I'm going back. I'm going to try and get back. And the last thing I want to show you is, I think it's Mother Shipton's found a waterfall in Yorkshire, and a student, if people have been going there, and there used to be an old sort of witch-like lady who lived there in past centuries ago, and the waterfall, if you put things in the waterfall for long enough, like 6 months, would start to make teddy bears into stone. So he put a window. It works mostly on fabric, so that's one of his. And he designed a house, a very surreal house, that's all about channeling this carboniferous limestone or whatever it is into a house and bridge across the river at that point, and taking some of the protocols of surrealism. He produced a project which was extraordinary because it was all about time and duration and density of water and the placement and impermanent irrigation system to channel it. And that's why you see all the numbers and the pipes around the drawings. And again, very much time-based. That's it. I'm going to stop there.
Neil, thank you very much for that. Series of extraordinary images. I guess most, if not all, produced digitally. Perhaps some were hybrids. And if, in a way, your talk is about both the post-digital, but it's a sort of acknowledgement that you kind of can't have the post-digital without having the digital alongside it. Isn't that right?
No, absolutely. It's a synthesis of everything, the analog and the digital. I mean, in the old days, and I talked about it a lot about, going fully virtual. Nowadays, we're operating in a kind of super space that is coalescing the real and the actual in almost a seamless way. The images, some of them, the last set, the Mother Shipton's house, is purely hand-drawn. Other projects are a mixture of infrared photography and Photoshop, and others are, whatever became a Form Z, or, you know, so they're all mixtures. I think the most dexterous students now and the most dexterous architects are using all media in all different ways. My friend Vaughan Oliver, very famous 80s record cover designer, always said about taking technology and never reading the instruction book and just going for it. Because if you read the instruction booklet, you do the same as everyone else, and that's the last thing you want.
I've got another question before I hand over to Jeremy Melvin to ask a couple, and it's about your thing about erasure and looking at things through the iPhone, even though you may be in real space at the time. And I came across this recently at the Venice Biennale, where if you went into the German pavilion, the spaces and the volumes were devoid of anything at all except giant QR codes. So you had to go over and point your mobile at the QR code, and then it told you what the exhibition was about. All I can say, I felt completely cheated because I had no idea why I just couldn't do that from the comfort of my own home and point my mobile at a QR code on the screen. And I wonder what in your world, where you sort of hover between the real and the virtual and everything in between, whether you ever feel the same sort of thing. I'd rather it was one or the other, but not both.
Well, I think I think the both is more powerful. So you know, with the Gaudi example, you're actually in it, you're smelling it, you can touch it. There's a visceral experience as well as the virtual erasure if you choose to do that. You don't have to do it. So for me, it's the hybrid of the two that's exciting. I don't think I've lost a lot of interest in the purely virtual over the years. I first started writing about augmented reality in 1998. I think for building design interactive at the time, and that was very interesting because, you know, you can train surgeons on it, you can train operatives to make space frames. You know, the instructions. IKEA need to do this, I think, so that it trains us to make IKEA furniture in a much more efficient way than just trying to work out what the exploded axonometric is trying to tell you to do. But so I think those sorts of technologies will arrive fairly soon. But to me, it's the in between it's always been, I think, the blurred boundary between, you know, architecture and art, architecture, technology, architecture and the scope that you're looking at, the scale of the scope that you're looking at. It's the in between. I think we're moving into an in between era in a way, and I'm just really appalled how boring architects are with it.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Well, it strikes me that each of your 7 continua, although they depend on a certain sort of technology of the last 20 or 30 years in the way you describe them, are actually things that architects have been playing with for centuries, if not millennia. And what I wonder about, that we could all think of, great Renaissance and perhaps even more so Baroque spaces as well as Gothic spaces, where the whole idea, the whole design idea, is to distort the way reality might be perceived. And that can have an ideological route, or it can have a purely pleasurable route, as in the case of certain sorts of picturesque landscape. But I just wonder whether the technologies of relatively recent date are simply adding to what has already existed, or whether they're actually transforming the possibilities of how architects think.
I think you're right. I think there is yet another continuum that talks about, well, I talked about it a little bit, semiotics, and then that goes right through millennia of architectural history. Maybe I'm rallying against the purely commercial of the last let's call it 75 years. Maybe that's the thing that I'm rallied about. I mean, I started my career mouthing off about modernism before the technologies that allowed me to potentially corrupt it in the late 80s and 90s. So I think you're right. There is a continuum there, and there are lots of people I know who are doing very exciting things. You know, LiDAR scanning Piranesi's altarpiece in his church, or Hawksmoor, or trying to reinterpret Borromini in contemporary computer lofting thingies. So I think there is an interest coming that's looking back beyond this kind of well, you could call it a lacuna or lacunae of capitalist, late capitalist modernism. So there are people out there doing these sorts of things. I encouraged a colleague when I was at Greenwich to 3D scan Hawksmoor's St Alfred's Church, and that revealed all sorts of wonderful spaces that people didn't quite know there, or ways that loads come from the roof to the ground, and an almost biological kind of system in the crypt that contrasts with. It could
also, of course, be something to do with how architects think, as well as to do with technological possibilities. And one thinks of the comment that Banham made in what would have been his inaugural lecture at the Institute of Fine Arts in New York, but became his final published essay, where he says that he draws attention to a very different approach to design that two great contemporaries, Wren and Hawksmoor, took. And he says, I think rather fatuously, that this shows that Hawksmoor was an architect and Wren was not. I think they're both architects practicing in different ways. But the point is that he suggests there's something about the way Hawksmoor thinks, which is profoundly architectural. Whereas, of course, Wren's great strength was that he could think outside architecture because he was basically a mathematician, a scientist. And so I think what you're doing is taking, to some extent at least, taking Banham's slightly fatuous, almost throwaway line at the end of his life and making something much more serious about it, which is that architects have a certain way of thinking, or certain sorts of architects have a way of thinking, which allows them to imagine in a certain way, and then that they will use that like a prosthetic, which might have been, as you said, in very early days, a simple stone axe, or it might now be the most sophisticated piece of interactive technology.
I agree totally. I always look at Hawksmoor, as I always describe him to students, as the first punk architect, because he was a very naughty boy. Whereas you're right, Wren, having existed at the University of Greenwich for quite a few years in some of the Wren interiors, it's really an exterior set of buildings. And of course, it's very complicated, and other people got involved, and Hawksmoor got involved as well. So yes, the way architects think, the epistemology of architecture in certain eras, I think is very different. I mean, if you go back to the 80s, where, me and you trained as architects, there was a different way of thinking about architectural space. I think a much more interesting way of thinking about architectural space, even though it wasn't invigorated by technology. Now I see boredom most of the time when I look at work, both of professional architects, but also of students. And I think there's something going wrong with architectural education that's not showing students the full gamut of what's spatially and materially possible in the architectural world and architectural discourse of the 20 years into the 21st century. And it worries me.
Can I ask?
Because I think
can I ask a mundane question? But as you were showing these beautiful drawings, so I'm admiring, as it were, the art and craft that has gone into these things. and the sort of ideas that have led to these extraordinary productions. And the question I was asking myself is, have the people who've done this ended up designing buildings in architects' offices? Or in fact, are we looking at a kind of a really interesting group of people actually are not that interested in making buildings? What they're interested in is ideas about buildings. Could you say a bit about, you mentioned I think one or two had gone on into teaching careers, but you know, is that true of all of them or most of them?
All of them have become qualified architects. A lot of them have worked initially at Part 3 level and beyond for world famous architects, both in the UK and internationally, and have then split off to form their own practices or have gone into academia. Most have split off to form their own practices. I would say, and most of them, or some of them, have continued to PhD level and become academics through my supervision. But yes, most of them, they're all architects and they all do buildings. They probably don't do as interestingly, and I'm sorry if there's any listening, as interestingly as they did as students, but that's true for everyone, I think. Well, rare exceptions.
But it is interesting. It is interesting what happens. Not that there needs to be a practical application of any of these ideas, but have you seen buildings where actually you can see the ideas that were in those drawings emerging into the buildings as well? I think this is a very rare condition, isn't it?
It is a rare condition. The first true answer, I suppose, is no, not yet, but that doesn't mean never. Another interpretation of the answer to your question is yes, but in a maybe a much more simple and economic way.
Jeremy, final question or comment?
Yes, another actually slightly prosaic one, but how do protocells reproduce?
They don't reproduce, you make them by, I think it's a kind of syringe and bubble mixture, or it's, you know, flicking your wrist with some salad cream.
Okay.
They don't reproduce because they've got there's nothing in them. They're just bubbles.
There's nothing that can make them reproduce. So
no,
they are as it were solid
state. Yeah. I mean, it's salad dressing basically in aqueous fluid, and you make your bubbles accordingly, and they have a lifespan. And depending on their chemical constitution, of the way you mix the aqueous fluid and the bubbles, depends on and if you inject a bubble with a chemical gradient or something. You know, that's what the whole research was about. There was a whole lab. There is a whole lab in the Southern University of Denmark that explores these parameters. And that was great, working in a cross-disciplinary way.
One last question to conclude. I wonder what your reflections are about your own drawings and the evolution of your own drawing style, and the things you think about, and whether the evolution of that over, I guess, 3 decades, whether you find echoes with the sort of work of those students you've been describing. Do you see yourselves as kind of parallels or worlds apart?
Very much as parallels. I mean, I showed you very quickly a group of student work that has evolved simultaneously while I've been on my 30-year communicating vessels project. And most of that project deals with augmented realities of some sort, numinous presences, mnemonics, the idea of the microcosm of the house and garden for architecture, or surrealist memory palace. It's a whole 30-year thing, and thousands of drawings. So I see us all at a certain point, those pictures I showed you and also my work, as pioneers into an unfurrowed field of architectural ideas not necessarily unfarrowed. I mean, you have to come with something. For me, as I said, it's the surrealist protocols of space making and artistic production that allow me to reinterpret those technologies of today. So yes, no, I see it. My project's better, obviously.
And what a great note to end on. It's been a fascinating session. Neil Spiller, thank you very much indeed, and see you soon.
Thank you, guys. I know I'm seeing you soon. Bye.